Hey, poker peeps, this is Sky with Smart Poker Study. This video is a companion piece to podcast episode number 351, and right here on the screen, you can see there's the URL for this episode. You can type that right in, or in the description below, click the link right there to go to this episode. But in this video, I'm going to show you how I would actually learn from this episode and take notes and put them in my poker journal, utilizing the show notes page for the podcast episode. So you're going to need two things for this. Of course, the show notes page open up and your trusty Word document, or maybe whatever other kind of software that you keep notes in. A few different steps to this. You got a blank canvas right here. I always like the navigation menu, and you'll see why in just a little bit. But to turn the navigation menu on, just click on View up here, Show, and then turn it on by selecting that box. Step number one is highlight the title, right-click with your mouse, hit copy, or you could hit Control and C on your keyboard, but we'll hit copy here. Over here, go to the first line, right-click once again, and hit this paste icon. This is going to keep the source formatting. This is just how I prefer to see my notes. And as you can see, it kind of looks like the heading right over here. Now on the very next line, what you're going to do is copy and paste the entire text over here. So highlight, left click and then drag down all the way through the document down to the bottom right here. Go back up within the highlighted text, right click, copy over here, right click, and then that same keep source formatting paste. Bam. So what you're going to see if we scroll back to the top here and scroll to the top here, you're going to see it's basically going to mimic everything, right? It doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't have this podcast player, but it does have everything else. The picture is there, all the text is there, the heading, why are HUD stats important, matching this one over here. Table of contents, of course, it doesn't open the table of contents, but you see the text right here. Now, this is what I would do if I were you at this point. You're going to be playing the podcast episode. As you play and listen to it, you're going to be editing the notes right over here. Oh, one thing before I forget, the navigation, you could see once we copy and pasted with the source formatting, we have all the headings. So later on in the future, if you have a question about 3-bet, oh, Sky talked about 3-bet in that one episode, you click on the heading right here, bam, it takes you directly to your notes on 3-betting based on this podcast episode. Let's scroll back to the top now. So let's imagine you were listening to the episode. Actually, I shouldn't say let's imagine. The first step, once you have everything pasted into Word, you want to start listening to the episode, following along and deleting anything that's unnecessary, while at the same time, you are adding notes for anything that comes to your mind as you're listening to stuff, right? So Sky says, in the podcast episode, me talking right now, once you play it, you're going to hear me say stuff like this. I've always been a numbers guy. The HUD statistic math I'm about to share with you, blah, blah, blah. This stuff really isn't useful for your notes, right? So I would simply highlight it and delete it. Listen to this pod? I don't need that. Table of contents? I don't need that. I got the table of contents right here, right? Oh, but the first thing, why are HUD stats important? So maybe as you're listening, you feel, oh, this entire paragraph, these two paragraphs make sense. I like having the screenshot here because it shows me exactly the 158 combos that Sky's talking about, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you think all of this stuff is great. You're listening to the episode, you're deleting this and that. Oh, 7 critical HUD and report statistics? Well, I don't really need this information. He's just telling me what I'm about to see here. Bam. You delete that right there. So you're constantly deleting items. You can see we're at 2,100 words. By the time you get to the end of this document, you might be left with 700 words or so, maybe even just 500, but they're the most important 500 words that you learned from the podcast episode that you want to take with you into the future. Let's look at one thing over here, for example, the number of hands. Okay, so you understand in your HUD what the number of hands is. In this episode, I give you the stat description. This is simply the number of hands you've played against an opponent. The formula is just the total number of hands. I don't need to know that. I already know that. That's obvious from the statistic. So delete that information. Bam, we went down to 2,074 words. It just, deleted a few words that you don't need to know. Want to play poker tournaments? I don't need that link. I already played poker tournaments with Sky, right? So delete that as well. So let's take a look at the number of hands. Putting the number in perspective. Actually, let's do this. Minimize maximize that. And we'll go down this so it's a little bit easier to see. The number of hands. Let's imagine you're listening to the podcast and you're hearing me talk about all this stuff. Okay, putting the number of hands into perspective. Well, I don't need this. 2 hours with Susie, blah, blah, blah. 100 hands is, oh, maybe that's the first bit of information that I can really use. 150 hands against a player gives me a decent feel for them. And then Sky goes on to say, okay, 150 hands is decent. 500 hands. Well, 500 hands is good. And then Sky goes on to say 1,000 hands. That's where we really see what Susie's made of. Great, right? So now you go ahead and delete. You turned an entire section with like 5 paragraphs down to just the most important stuff right here that you need to potentially use to take with you into the future. And let's say that this gives you a little idea. Let's type in an action step that we can give ourselves, because you're thinking about this information, and in the podcast, I don't give you an action step with the number of hands. But now maybe you have an action step for yourself. And you think to yourself, well, Sky says 150 hands is a decent feel. Maybe at 150 hands, I should examine my opponent's stats and list 3 exploits, right? And this is something that you can just come up with on your own as you're listening to the podcast. 150 is a decent hand, a decent feel to start exploiting them. Great. I'm going to list 3 exploits. So the next time you're playing you're playing a session, you have one table open. As soon as you see a player with 150 hands or more, oh, this is your opportunity. Whip out a piece of paper. Start taking notes. Okay, his C-bet's at 33%. How can I exploit that? His fold to steal is at 88%. How can I exploit that? His 3-bet's at 2% in the small blind. How can I exploit that? And so make action steps. I'm sorry. Well, this is making an action step for yourself, but then you're actually going to take action with it on the felt and list 3 exploits based on whatever you learn about your opponents. All right, thank you so much for watching this simple video. I highly recommend with the next podcast episode that you listen to, whether it's one of mine or somebody else's, do exactly this. Copy their show notes, put it into your poker journal, and then edit it down to the most useful information. Create action steps, of course. Oh, here's an interesting thing, right? You see the number of hands is a heading right here. Let's turn the action step into a heading. Let's go home and just do heading. Oh, I don't see a heading 3 here. Once we have heading 2, you can see, let me see here. Number of hands is actually a heading 3. So 3, and then now let's add it to a heading 4. So the number of hands, this is our action step that we created from the number of hands. Later on, when we're listening to and learning and editing the VPIP section, we simply create another action step, highlight that step, and hit heading 4. Bam! Here's the next action step, as you can see, related to VPIP, and so on and so forth for you. All right, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up down below, and please subscribe to the channel so you can get information or get notifications of every new episode that hits the YouTube airwaves. Thanks much, and I'll catch you later.